Let's get ready to dive into the running backs for the NFL draft with one of our favorite running back analysts. It is Scott Barrett. We're going to have very insightful thoughts, I think, both on the wide receivers in a later edition. We're going to talk some tight ends. We're going to start off with the running backs. And I know this is one that has been in the works for a couple of weeks, and I'm excited to dive in and get his thoughts on a number of these players. Shawn, I know that you've been very enthusiastic about getting this show. We teased it last week. We usually release OT on a Monday. We pushed it out to have a Tuesday edition here to get Scott on the show. So as we kick things off, Scott, how are you doing here on 1st of April? Any April Fool's pranks happen you today? Is that a thing in the US as it is over here in Ireland?
Yeah. I loved it when I was a kid. I remember in like the 4th grade, I took a Snickers bar and I injected it with ketchup, and then I fed it to my friend on April Fool. I'm like, hey, I have a free Snickers bar. I don't want this. And he didn't even notice it. He was like, yeah, that was good. Thanks for the Snickers bar.
So that does not sound like fun. Around that age group, I used to love ketchup when I was a kid, and I ate so much of it that now it absolutely disgusts me. So it wasn't true eating it through a Snickers bar, but that sounds like it would also have the same effect. Shawn, how are you? Are you eating any tomato ketchup-based products today?
No. But I was thinking it's interesting. It's fun that we have Scott on here on April 1st. Obviously, we teased it last week. We're kind of hoping. I've got some construction going on outside my house here, which is annoying me a bit. We're hoping that 3 or 4 different people. We should have set this up, and we can figure out probably what we would have needed to do, which is a series of people pulling the fire alarm in Scott's neighborhood there. But I mean, that gives a little bit of energy for this show and how well it's gone over the last several years. As we mentioned, we've been looking forward to this one. Scott, I wanted to start you with more of a big picture question. We know that this running back class is really talented at the top. We know that there are a lot of interesting profiles all the way through. You hear teams that need running backs talking about how they, might grab one early, but they might wait till, 5th, 6th, 7th round. We think through all of those things, and sometimes we can lose track of how we want to think about different players and different profiles. So as you're going through your research, you're building your models, you're thinking about how you want to draft players, how much does a running back's full career arc matter? And I have some examples that I'd like to go through. How much does Judkins' massive freshman season matter? How much does Gordon's insane 2023 matter? How much does it matter that guys like Harvey and Skattebo, who I think are just really, really interesting, but I mean, if you compare them against NFL players, which is what their age is, then maybe, it looks a little bit different. But before we go into those specifics, move us back and take us through the big picture here in terms of how we're looking at running backs and whether or not more than just the 2024 season and some of the fireworks there. How does the overall arc matter?
Yeah, so I just want to say I love this class. I think in your rookie drafts, you can just take a shotgun blast approach to the running back position. It's going to be really hard to miss. Very deep class. Absolutely love it, especially relative to the wide receivers. But yeah, that's a great question. That's a really important question to ask. I will say my process, my model probably disagrees with some of the stuff you look at, you value at the position, and that's not me saying I'm right and you're wrong, because your hit rate is phenomenal at the position. But I know, the way I look at it, the way I do it, the way what my model tells me is a little bit different than some other people, where it says age is actually a little overrated at the running back position, at least especially relative to a wide receiver. And then you have us now today in the NIL era, the transfer portal era. I think that matters a little bit less. He's not an early declare. Yeah, but he got paid $3 million to stay. And so, in my model, there's these important variables. There's career production and efficiency. There's best season production and efficiency. There's final season. And what my model tells me is final season is really important. Maybe even a little more important than best season. And so, yeah, that's just the way for years, I've always kind of said, age isn't anywhere near as important with running backs as it is wide receivers. It still matters, still important, but maybe a little overblown. And yeah, best season too. It's like if a guy explodes as a freshman, like a Shawn Tucker, and then he disappears, you don't want that. My model likes to see steady linear growth. That's something that's important. That's valuable. That's impactful. But yeah, I'm excited to dive into the specifics of some of these unique prospects.
When we look at the stars, maybe the most interesting, in some ways controversial of those guys is Quinshon Judkins, in part because he's overshadowed by an arguably more explosive player when they're teammates. But that teammate also had a fantastic freshman season, and yet then didn't have the steady production. With Judkins, he comes in and is just extraordinary right away in the SEC. Many of the different metrics that are encouraging, you would argue that he had his best season right off the bat. How should we be looking at that? And is it a concern that he was overshadowed in 2024?
Yeah, so it was a phenomenal freshman season. He gained the second most rushing yards of any SEC freshman all time, behind only 1980 Herschel Walker. And so that looks great. But then you zoom in and you see Zach Evans had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage, averaged 6.5 yards per carry to Judkins 5.7. And you're like, all right, that's you remember Shawn Tucker, right? The hype on Shawn Tucker in the Devi dynasty community. And you're like, okay, well, that's a little weird. Maybe it's a nitpick, but then you zoom out and it seems endemic of all the concerns I have on Judkins. I like these questions you pick. I'm looking at the whole show sheet here, but you picked a number of the ones that, I put tweets out that got a lot of attention. And so, yeah, less efficient than Zach Evans. The following season, dreadfully inefficient by box adjusted yards per carry. I think it was like one of the worst seasons of the past decade, maybe like third worst of any drafted running back. And so that wasn't great. And then, like you said, last year, Travion Henderson, sure, he's a stud, but dramatically more efficient. I had some crazy stat where it's like in power conference games, Henderson averaged 6.6 yards per carry to Judkins 4.6. It's so bad. That's like bottom 3 in the class. And if you look at throughout the totality of his career, him versus his backfield peers, he was a full 1.0 yards per carry less than the rest of the backfield. And so you with Judkins, you get a lot of hype, a lot of film guys like him. They're comps I've seen are Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Kareem Hunt. But you look at these players and you see, 80th percentile or better yards per route run, yards after contact per attempt, yards from scrimmage per touch. And with Judkins, you have 20th percentile or 30th percent. And it really inefficient. And so like the comp I wanted to go with was poor man's Najee Harris, like slightly poorer man's Najee, where you had lesser efficiency in college, but amazing counting stats, a ton of volume. He was a workhorse, and that matters. My model loves to see that. But like that, it wasn't even comparable. Like Najee Harris blew him out of the water by yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per touch, yards per route run, all the efficiency metrics I like. And so this is really concerning to me. Another thing we disagree on is like, I think athleticism is a little overrated. Maybe not at the polar extremes. And luckily for him, he was a polar extreme freak athlete, 91st percentile spork score. That's my custom athleticism metric. But yeah, this is just not one of my guys. Like I typically love, you have two guys in the backfield, both supposed round 2 prospects. One is hyper efficient. One got a ton of touches. I typically gravitate more towards that player. But the efficiency numbers were just so concerning. There's no comparison for it. Like I kept looking for players who had counting stats this good and efficiency this bad. And it's just, no one really came. It was like Kerryon Johnson, Alexander Madison. It was rough out here. So just not one of my guys, Quinshon Judkins.
Well, it's interesting too, when you watch him play, for a guy who does need that size, athleticism package to matter. He's got a lot of highlights where he just runs out of bounds. And I mean, if those are some of your better plays, that's concerning. Take us to another player with just huge raw production, but obviously not only the production, but the peripherals really fall off a cliff in 2024. I still really want to like Ollie Gordon because of the sheer size of that 2023 season. You mentioned peak and how that works into the model. How much excitement should we have about someone with a 2,000 yards per scrimmage season?
Yeah, so I actually adjusted before I even looked at Ollie Gordon. I kind of made some tweaks in the model, one of which was I bumped, best season, whatever, because of like Chuba Hubbard, who had this, great breakout year. And then I'm digging into Ollie Gordon, and like, they just seem like the exact same player to me. And that's not just a helmet comp. They went to the same school, but like height, weight, athleticism, they're just about exactly the same. And then they had that insane sophomore season with like absolutely incredible sophomore season. One of the best single season performances from any running back in this class was Gordon's 2023, and then just totally fell off of a cliff in 2024. So he ended up coming out okay. I did have some concerns, but yeah, ultimately, there's different factors that can come into play. It's possible that, he was dealing with an injury. He wasn't. What really probably happened was just this team was like absolute. They lost their final 9 games in a row, including a humiliating 52-0 shutout against Colorado. The run blocking was one of the worst in the country. And so just like everything fell apart. And he's also of that archetype where, you expect better production and positive game script. And so he was held back by that. If you adjust for that, over the last 2 years, 135 rushing yards per game in wins rather than, 66 in losses. And so, yeah, I think you just have to contextualize that a bit, but no, this was a player I liked. Is certainly versus, where he's going in rookie drafts. I think that's solid. I think that's fine.
I do like to hear the Chuba. Chuba was so much better in college, I think, than people realize. And it was exciting to see him have a good NFL season because he got off to such a terrible start for such a long time that how amazing he was in that season you referenced, I think gets overlooked. And it is something that even matters to me to this day when I'm like, he was really good in 2024, but also before a lot of weird stuff happened, he was an extraordinary college football player, better than most of the people that I think are perceived in a much different light. I want to take us to a couple of the players who, in many ways they're trendy. You could argue that they're overdrafted, and yet when you watch them, when you look at their metrics, part of me just wants to put them up in that top group because they just look so extraordinary. Talking again about Harvey now and Skattebo, who, this production comes late. You mentioned that that's a little bit overstated, but you didn't come out and say, it doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. So how should we think about what that means in terms of putting it in context and where these guys should be going and just how good you think they were?
Yeah, well, as always, you need more context. The context on RJ Harvey was he was a quarterback all throughout high school. He was a quarterback his freshman season. Then he had an ACL injury, which cost him another year after he converted to running back. But so you only had 3 seasons of him playing running back, and he was freaking awesome. He was incredible. Like I love this player. I am much higher on him than I think most other people, especially within the analytics community. And maybe that's because, I think age is a little overrated with running backs. But I absolutely love him. And Skattebo, it's the exact same thing. The excuse you can make for him is, I don't know, racism or something, but like he was awesome in high school. He rushed for, as a high school junior, rushed for 3,550 yards, 42 touchdowns. He helped his team win the California State Championship. In that game, he had 393 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Sacramento State was the only D1 program to offer him a scholarship. He goes to the FCS. And like, I typically don't put too much stock in this FCS production, whatever, unless it's like 99th percentile efficiency, which is exactly what he had. His first year, 9.1 yards per carry. His second year was 97th percentile by missed tackles forced per touch. I think 99.9 percentile first downs per carry. Goes to Arizona State. Last year, one of the analytically most impressive seasons ever. I just kept putting out tweets on stats on Twitter where it's just like, here's the only players to ever do this. And it's Skattebo, McCaffrey. It's Skattebo, Saquon, McCaffrey. It's Skattebo, Jeanty, Saquon, McCaffrey. And so like, I absolutely adore this. I'm trying hard to find red flags. You don't really see it in the combine. Personally, I mean, he's just like a slightly below average athlete, but like he's also like a clone of a Mark Ingram, Kareem Hunt, David Montgomery. Our film guy Brett Whitefield said, no, he's so much lesser athletic than that.
But I mean, he's a rich man's version of those guys in terms of anything that you see on the football field and with the results. Is that, I mean, when I'm telling people about him, like this is a rich man's version of those guys you mentioned, not someone who
with way more pass catching upside. Analytically speaking, this is if you just ignore the age and you ignore the athleticism, 99th percentile, and then you factor in the athleticism, and it's 96th percentile, and then you factor in which I say is overrated. Then you factor in the age, which again I say is overrated. It's still like 95th and so like I'm having to be careful to like because it scares me because our film guy Brett Whitefield is just like. It's practice squad caliber athleticism. He's RB9 and it's just like everything telling me, no, this guy is a stud. He's David Montgomery with way more pass catching juice, missed tackle freak. I freaking love him. He's going to be one of my guys. I think it's one of those things where it's just like for better or worse, he's one of my guys. If he's my, Elijah Moore of running backs, like that's fine. I'll rest easy at night. It's just the analytics profile too good. Oh, and then you have Brashard Smith too, is another guy like this. Yeah. I mean, he was a wide receiver and he was like a really productive wide receiver, at least in one of those seasons. And so like, in general, overrated. And then when you have like factors like this, I think you could pretty easily excuse those.
Yeah. So Brashard,
there is, but like to your point, it's not like if you're listening at home, you're not thinking like, oh, I have 2 fewer years of this player of peak production on my dynasty team. That's not what matters. It's the inherent advantage that comes with age where, this is a 23-year-old, just blowing up a 19-year-old. And so that's where it matters. But even then, I think it's overstated.
Brashard Smith was somebody I was going to bring up next, along with Kaleb Johnson. Looking at some of the stuff you take into consideration for the running backs, both of them kind of been 1-year wonders. You mentioned the position change for Smith, and then Johnson, he's an early declare. Is the 1 year kind of hit something that is a positive or negative when you're taking them into your model?
No, 1-year wonder is like absolutely a negative, but again, this is something that requires additional context. And Brashard Smith, what an insane year! His only year, like with more than 7 carries, and he played running back full time, and he was great at it. You saw the same thing with the Tyrone Tracy. No, that's awesome. That speaks to impressive upside. And so like with my model, I'm totally okay just like kind of disagreeing with it, moving off of it. I have it as this baseline. Like JJ Zacharyson, like amazing job with his model and what he does, but like I'm much more, let me manually tweak this, let me manually adjust this. And maybe that's a mistake or whatnot. But Kaleb Johnson, maybe I think my model views him as a 1-year wonder, but I personally do not. He was great his freshman season. He broke Iowa's freshman record in rushing yards. He smoked all the other running backs in efficiency, 5.2 yards per carry to 3.4. And then the next year, he dealt with an ankle injury for the entirety of the season. It happened in camp. Then he re-aggravated or sprained it in week 2. And you had the coach come out at the end of the season. He was never quite himself. He just didn't trust that ankle. And yeah, and so like I could excuse that year. And what are you left with is like a really great freshman season for freshman season standards. And then last year numbers insane.
And then when we look at, players who have had, limited total production, how much are you placing emphasis on peripherals? If we look at somebody like Omarion Hampton, didn't have great evasion numbers in 2023, despite playing in the ACC. Is that something that's a knock on him?
And so obviously he's a little bit of a different one from the guys that we have coming up. But I did want to kind of throw that in there off the top because he is someone who really pops for most people. And I'm obviously going to be excited about him also. But I see this element here. I'm like, that's a little bit odd. Is it odd in terms of what you're seeing or just one of those things that happens sometimes?
So I didn't see this. Maybe I need to dive back into it, but I know
and this is SIS, and obviously different data sources are going to chart certain things differently.
Oh yeah. So I'm seeing like that. Like I read Rich Rebar's articles. They're great. If you guys haven't read them, definitely check that out. But like we are way off on like so many different numbers, and I'm just sticking with PFF just because that's what I've used for so long, and that goes into I like don't even really look at it. But yeah, he had over 1,000 yards after contact in both seasons. Jonathan Taylor, AJ Dillon, the only other running backs you can say they've done that. 4.01 career yards after contact per attempt. Think that trails only Bijan and Travis Etienne among running backs with like 600 or more career receiving yards. And I don't know, everything I'm seeing looks awesome. He kind of actually has like the same concern as Ashton Jeanty, where despite playing in the power conference, he had a fairly light strength of schedule. But I mean, no, I thought his 2023 was great with Drake May. Then Drake May leaves and he actually gets better somehow. He's my RB2 in the class. I think if I would just going off the numbers, ignored projected draft capital, might be Skattebo. But for right now, he's my RB2. I feel pretty good about that.
And Dylan Sampson, he was somebody who was better than Jalen Wright when they played together in 2023.
That's another one I disagree with. I don't see that. So Jalen Wright had.
It's interesting there because the SIS numbers are extremely definitive on this topic, which doesn't mean they're correct. I'm just saying that they show big differences between these two players.
So I see the exact opposite from PFF. And, that's not to say PFF's right. Maybe I'm better off blending these, but 2023, Jalen Wright, 97th percentile yards per touch, 95th percentile yards after contact per attempt, 89th percentile yards per route run. With Dylan Sampson, you get 77th, 75th, 39th percentile. So it was a clear step down. And then I was never high on Jalen Wright to begin with. It's sort of a function of this Tennessee offense where you're just getting super light fronts. And so I came away sort of a Dylan Sampson hater versus consensus, but maybe that's just me.
Next one up, we'll see if you have a difference on this one. Jarquez Hunter, better than Tank Bigsby?
Yeah, dude, I love Jarquez Hunter, and I really want to be just like flag planting him, but Brett Whitefield, our film guy over at Fantasy Points, doesn't love him. Danny Kelly, who's one of the best film evaluators for running backs out there, if not the best. He was like, he ran stiff and whatever, but like the stats are great. And I love him because he's the reason I missed on Tank Bigsby, because when Tank Bigsby was coming out, I was like, well, he only averaged 5.17 yards per carry the last 2 years. This guy, Jarquez Hunter, averaged 6.53. So like, and like no one talks about Jarquez. So like, what makes us think this guy's good? But yeah,
what do you mean you missed on Tank Bigsby? He's been like very much just a guy.
All right. Well, then I hit perfect.
The epitome of average.
I don't know. There's hype now. Like, I mean, where did you have Travis Etienne? Like, he's out touching Travis Etienne. Like that has to mean something. He was top 3 in yards after contact per attempt last year.
Right. But in the context of them not being able to move the ball, him not being somebody that they needed to have on the field.
Fair. All right. I just mean like I buried
Etienne was hurt, right? And
that's true.
So it's going to be really sad if Etienne goes the same way as Javonte Williams, which I mean seems kind of to be
seems more likely than not.
What was that
at
injury?
One point? Etienne, I think it's just the accumulation of things at this point.
What was the surgery he had? Was it a Liz Frank? I don't know. maybe it's not important. Yeah, accumulation things.
I mean,
I don't know. It's
Etienne
heartbreaking because I'll
was
write
gonna
these
be-
players up and it's like best since Travis Etienne, and it's ugh.
If he had left early, as opposed, I mean,
I
we
know.
love that he stayed. Anyway, so Hunter.
It was a list, Frank. But it's 2021. But he's not.
Yeah,
been the same since.
that's. I remember talking to an injury guy about it. He said that one's like hit or miss. Well, you'll get guys who just can't come back from that. But yeah, I had crazy good stats for Jarquez Hunter, and yeah, the big concern with him was, more efficient than Tank Bigsby, but Bigsby had way more carries. Like, can he be a workhorse? He has size concerns. He profiles as this like home run hitter. But I mean, he was pretty great in a bell cow role last year. He led the SEC in yards per carry. That's not an easy feat. So yeah, he's going to be one of my guys, even if most film experts disagree.
And as you mentioned that, how are you filtering that? Let me ask you that again on a different player, because I think it's going to be fun to hear what you have to say on that one as it relates to kind of that point or that context. Trevor Etienne, he's a guy again here where SIS says he's been better than his committee mates everywhere he's been. Lots of different situations. The committee mates in many cases pretty decent players, but even with that, his coaches are like, I mean, you're not the guy that we trust with the ball that often. So how are you working through that? And do you think, I mean, we're looking at James Cook right now, coming off of a collegiate career that really didn't suggest what he's been able to do at the NFL level. And even then, I mean, the Bills could use him more, and that would be better for fantasy. But he's morphed into a guy where it's the right situation to maximize the value of his touches. Etienne, great peripherals, probably pretty good, if not elite athleticism. Where are you here?
Yeah, I think that's a great player to bring up. The two little brothers. James Cook was, one of my worst misses. Like I totally had him buried for all the reasons you said. And my model hates guys like this who are just always their RB2, where at least like Jarquez Hunter last year was a bell cow. You had Travion Henderson his first year as a bell cow, but guys who just don't do it at all, they're just dead and buried. And that was the case with me. I dug into the numbers. PFF didn't say he was, the most efficient running back either. And so I'm only writing up 12 guys for my article. He didn't make the cut. He was just someone I had buried for all those reasons. Maybe he goes somewhere, a perfect landing spot like a James Cook. And even then it's like James Cook was, like a 40% snap share his last 8 weeks. He insanely efficient, but he was also a step above the little Etienne from what I'm looking at in terms of efficiency.
So to kind of wrap through that and maybe into this next player. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that we knew that Tuten had a track background. We knew that, and again, at least with SIS, some of the peripherals in terms of something, for example, like points above average per play, where they're doing some charting adjustments, these look very, very, very good. You've got overall production, and yet not being drafted basically at all in early best ball. Now, some of that is the quality of the class, but I also get a very strong vibe, and you would have more exposure to exactly what the reasons are, but people don't like the way that he looks running the ball. So do we have any crazy takes on this controversial, trendy, exciting, whatever player? And how does that fit within what you mentioned a couple of times with what Brett is telling you on the scouting outlook on a player, and how much does that matter to you?
Well, I added Brett Whitefield's film score as a final variable. I actually haven't added it in yet. I'm finishing my article, and then that'll come in when I do the rankings. Right now, I'm trying to be like a purist and just stick mostly to the analytics profile. But the analytics profile is awesome. It's so insanely good. 96th percentile yards after contact per attempt, 98th percentile career missed tackles forced per touch. Then you have a 99th percentile athlete by Spork. And again, I say that's a little overrated, not at the polar extremes. And this is about as most polar extreme as you get from an athleticism standpoint. So this is like very clearly my guy or one of my guys. You dig deeper, horrible fumbling issues. I don't really care about that too much. It's very much like a home run hitter, like we saw Kenneth Walker's first 2 years, where it's the low success rate, the high explosive run rate. But man, I just freak athlete. Only since 2000, only 4 running backs, or only 3 running backs have ever recorded a better Spork score: Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Stewart, and AJ Dillon. So I don't know. Everything I'm seeing looks awesome. And even with Skattebo, he did have a historically efficient year in one of those FCS seasons. But a comp I've heard, and this is Theo Greminger, peak CJ Spiller. I kind of like that one a lot.
Shawn's smile seems to be getting larger as you continue to talk here.
He's a little undersized. You have that. That means he disagrees with me and he's scared.
No, it's the opposite.
The Spiller thing is funny though, because when you say CJ Spiller, I'm like, was that like a 2 games? The thing with Spiller is that he should have been awesome, but he wasn't. So that's both like really exciting and terrifying. I mean, Spiller should have
imagine CJ Spiller in today's NFL. Look at what Bucky Irving is doing. Look at what Jahmyr Gibbs is doing. That's my read on it.
So in the big piece that I put out with all the analytics and etc., doing a 4-round mock draft, and I decided to more or less ignore draft capital or projected draft.
It's so much more fun that way.
Yeah, I'm like, one of the things that I've increasingly been going to in the last several years is just, I feel like we don't have a wisdom of crowds at all, because everything is just cascades. So to combat that in a tiny little way and to have fun, it's like, I'm just going to put out my information, and it can be way off of consensus, and it's going to look bad because it's not going to have some of these things factored in that we need to include. And yet that's the only way you get to, you want individual analysts to inject their own take, or else, what is the point of this? Now you can come off of that and you can use the combination of different things, but if everybody is just chasing everybody else. Anyway, I had Skattebo and Tuten basically at that, 1-2 edge range.
Was that
my perception is ahead of
one at the end of round 1, early round 2?
Right.
Okay.
And quarterbacks, receivers, first round guys below them. Yeah. I felt weird about that on a few occasions, but with what you're saying here, it's like, no, that's probably where it should be.
I'm with you, and I applaud you. I love it. Dude, I'm so sick of the echo chamber, and scared to just say what you believe, which I've done on this and even this show. But yeah, man, I love it.
That's the advantage of when you just avoid social media. You don't have to worry about.
I'm so jealous. I know.
And something for the next question is something that I think we do every year when there's a consensus at the top of a position group. Last year it was Brock Bowers. We would talk about the tight end position. We'd talk about every other tight end under the sun, and then at the end we'd be so what about Brock Bowers? So in this one, is there anyone to challenge Jeanty for the RB1 spot in this class? And then your thoughts obviously on him. I feel like sometimes it's that player just doesn't get talked about because we think that they're so good.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's touching him. I think he's just about. I think he's a better prospect than Bijan Robinson. Probably better than Saquon. I absolutely love him. Numbers are insane. It's not just a 1-year wonder where he joined Barry Sanders as the only running back with over 2,600 rushing yards. The year prior, he led the FBS in yards from scrimmage per game. He has this wide receiver background from high school, and he also led all running backs in receiving yards per game, elite yards per route run, all the efficiency metrics out of control. The one knock you could say, and this is something I've harped on in the past so much, but I didn't do it with Jeanty, but I could have, is when you have a guy with this lesser competition or a guy coming in the group of 5, it calls into question a lot of things. And it's not just a matter of like, oh, okay, it came in the group of 5, so reduce his rushing yards by 20%. Oh, it's still elite. It doesn't really work like that. You just have it just look at the top 15 and it just stops really being all that predictive. It just seems more random. And you'll have like a Darrell Henderson who, if you don't control for competition, Darrell Henderson looks like one of the best running back prospects ever. He's one of my biggest misses ever. And so maybe that's but again, more context. He smashed all power conference teams last year. Even his bad game against Penn State he forced a missed tackle on over half of his touches. Like 90% of his yards came after contact. I think he's just easy 101, historically great, all that stuff. I love him.
So when you say historically great, can we get best running back prospect since Barry Sanders?
No. Christian McCaffrey was the GOAT. And I was dying on that hill at the time. I said guaranteed Hall of Famer, which I don't know, maybe that's more of a question these days due to health, but how do you stay healthy? Christian McCaffrey was just too insane with, especially the pass catching. So.
And that's definitely true. It would be fun if he had been, in a situation where the competition had been that good, because then I think we could make the claim that this is Christian McCaffrey with size and maybe more long speed.
Well, that's the thing I think the analytics community is like missing, is like, I see a ton of pass catching upside for this guy. And like, that's what really matters for fantasy PPR leagues. And I think he could do it all.
It's tough to come off of that. We want to do some controversial ones there, but to kind of wrap things up, do you have a favorite second tier, third tier, fourth tier, whatever back that you think is worth mentioning, isn't getting enough talk, or is misunderstood?
Yeah, I've definitely mentioned some of these guys, like Jarquez Hunter, who I like a little bit more. What I need to go back to is Tahj Brooks, where like I started when writing this article, I started sort of like at the bottom and worked my way up for some reason. And I was just like, well, he had 96 missed tackles in 2023. That's the 7th most this past decade. Last year, he averaged 155 rushing yards per game. He had at least 95 rushing yards in each of his last 22 games of college football. I did a bunch of research. I can't confirm it, but I'm pretty sure that's the most since Archie Griffin in the 1970s. And then I like dug in and I'm like, yeah, but like, 5th year player, efficiency metrics really poor. You look at players with like these career efficiency metrics, there's not a single hit there. But then I wrote up Quinshon Judkins about a week later, and now I'm thinking like, is he just arbitrage Quinshon Judkins? I kind of think so.
Well, you got us all excited, and then you're like, but
yeah, I do that. I know.
I like Tahj Brooks.
Pulled the rug out.
I think we should be higher on him for sure.
Is there any running backs left in the class that you think that should be highlighted for one reason or another that we haven't talked about, or do you think pretty much the main guys of note have been?
Yeah, I might have something in like a few weeks when I'm wrapping up this article. Do you have anything on that FCS, the FCS version of Christian McCaffrey, Lad Larison, who led the FCS in rushing yards per game last year, led all FCS running backs in receiving yards per game the year before that. I need to dig deeper, but I mean, he looked like a rich man's Dylan Lobby to me. It requires more research just because like the FCS is so weird where like there's like a group of 5 within the FCS, and he came from one of those sort of like no-name programs.
Yeah, it's tough. Anytime that you mention the lesser competition, I'm just thinking about your notes on Skattebo having like a 5,000 yard game in the state championship. Like, you probably can't just take 20% off of that. Is there a Brashard Smith arbitrage play?
No. So I tried very
so those guys
hard.
That are similar, you don't like.
I tried very hard to make the case for what are their names? Bucky, and then who is it? The Syracuse kid.
You could mention, Quinn Allen.
Yeah, there you go. The Quinn Allen, Jaquavius, Bucky, Marks. Just because like the pass catching numbers were so insane.
What about Jaden Blue?
He's someone I need to do more research on, but I wrote up the other two and I was like so pissed I wrote them up because the pass catching numbers are insane. But so you have to heavily discount the Marks's production when he came under Mike Leach because like, oh, insane pass catching number, but that's true of like every Mike Leach running back. And then with both guys is you just have like such red flag levels of rushing efficiency. Like the best case scenario, I think for either guy is like a JD McKissick. And even that kind of feels like a stretch to me. Maybe I'm being too hard on them, but yeah, just wasn't a fan. Jaden Blue, I do need to dig deeper on.
I'm interested in Blue. We've definitely gotten pushback from most of the people that we've had on when I bring him. It's always a bit of a concern, just again having the thing that you already want to believe confirmed. But when we got like 90 people in the rookie guide. We did like 60 for the rankings. I'm like, I just don't know how deep we would have to go to feel comfortable ranking Marks. It's like he should not be going in anything, including the NFL draft. Now, I say that it would be really cool if he proves me wrong. When you can catch passes, you've got a path to it. Let's go to the tight ends here, right? A little bit of a sharp turn, but I mean, the tight ends. So, Scott, you know that I'm obsessed with tight ends. Drafted a ton of them in all the rookie drafts. Really came through with Trey McBride in this last season. Now I'm all set, but I want to just keep loading up, especially, we do a lot of stuff with the FFPC. You got the RotoViz Triflex leagues there. The tight end premium is massive. We've got 3 guys here that look really interesting. And I know that with the brand and all that I'm supposed to like Colston, Loveland with the market share numbers and the age, and I just don't.
Ooh.
Tyler Warren and Fannin have put up these numbers that are like 5 seasons worth of production. And then Loveland is just like, yeah, I had a lot of Michigan's terrible passing offense and I'm young. How should we be looking at these 3 players? And I mean, is one of Warren or Fannin going to be the next Trey McBride?
So I wouldn't put Warren in the Trey McBride category as a player where he's like more of the Kittle or Gronk mold, but like maybe that's just splitting hairs from a fantasy perspective. Like I think this guy is.
If you want to put somebody in the Kittle or Gronk mold, you can, and we'll draft him pretty early.
Yeah. There you go. So I think he's a stud. This is like a really unique class. It looks special. You also like didn't mention Oronde Gadsden, who like. Maybe it's outdated now, but like was the dream of being like Jordan Matthews or like a wide receiver masquerading as a tight end, but getting that tight end positional tag that where it goes such a farther way for fantasy. And I wanted to say, like, I'm exactly like you. I load up on tight ends to a detriment in Dynasty. And then like in FFPC drafts, I will always be mocked for how many tight ends I land on my team by the end of it.
I don't think they mock you though when you end up with like Trey McBride and Brock Bowers.
Changes the narrative. There you go. And so who's laughing now, right? And so you look at this class, and we could start with Fannin, which was like he just came off of, no exaggeration, the greatest tight end season in FBS history. It was the most receiving yards from scrimmage of any other tight end ever, and it was like 300 more. Best ever yards per route run, best ever first downs per route run, and still like top 5 among all players. He had 50% of the team's receiving yards, 49.7 yardage market share, just all these numbers, absolutely incredible. And then you have, but it did come in the group of 5. And then you have Tyler Warren, where you could just say everything we just said, but most receiving yards of any tight end in power conference history, or most yards from scrimmage, with 400 more than the next closest player, Brock Bowers this past decade. Yards per route run, yards per target, yards per team pass attempt, like all the metrics we love and tend to look at, best ever from a power conference tight end. And so that goes a little bit farther for me than Fannin's, just because, again, like level of competition matters a little bit less for tight ends than it does wide receivers. Like you saw that with Trey McBride, and number of other, Dallas Goedert, and a number of other tight ends who have been successful. And so, yeah, do lean Warren, but it's also, we're at like already, I was saying, I think models just miss on tight ends, and look at the NFL missing on round 1 tight ends. Right. And so it's not like they're much better either, but it's something about, you see this production and it's not really a perfect, I don't know. It's not really like super, super helpful when projecting. We know with tight ends, athleticism is massively important. I think in combine history, there's only ever been one 66th percentile or below athlete at the position to have 1,000 yards, and that was Zach Ertz. And so you have to factor that in. That works against Fannin. Maybe the competition works against him, but more than that, it's just like, where is the NFL moving? And there's a great writer, I'll have to pull up his name because it's escaping me, Max something, but he talks a lot about this, how like that we were living in the spread era, and now we're living in the post spread era, which is more defined by positionless players. And he's saying, like Dalton Kincaid is just flat out a bust in today's NFL, and Kyle Pitts is really little more than just Mike Gesicki 2.0. And you can't have a tight end who can't block. It just, you seed too much in 12 personnel. Your rushing efficiency isn't good enough. And then in the passing game, why would you ever have a Dalton Kincaid on the field when a Khalil Shakir is so much better? And that's true in almost every instance, is you would just get a slot wide receiver who could do that better. And I think that's generally right. And so like, I worry about Fannin with his athleticism. I worry about him with his size. I really worry about NFL film analysts saying he's a fullback. What the heck? That doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, pre-combine, I ranked it 1 Warren, 2 Fannin, 3 Colston Loveland. Now I would put Colston up there above Fannin, and I really like Loveland. So I'm kind of curious why you're a hater, Shawn.
Well, make the case for him. I mean, the per play numbers are good. You mentioned the athleticism. One thing I would throw out for Fannin is that these guys who crushed him at the combine athletically were like not even remotely comparable athletically in terms of Senior Bowl tracking. Now, I don't
interesting.
know that means anything necessarily, but it seems like it's kind of one of those things where the player who was interesting kind of in the other direction is that, I mean, I have a decent amount of Donovan Edwards in Debbie. And so you look at what he does at the combine and you're like, maybe there's a chance. You look at his tracking at the Senior Bowl, and I mean, I would feel like if they put the whole thing on me and I went out there, that I couldn't have looked less interested than what Edwards had to have been to put up those tracking numbers, what kind of tracks with his production. The thing with the athleticism that matters usually, and it usually in a big way, that is obviously going to be somewhat correlated, but Blair's done a decent amount of research. Again, it's pretty intuitive that the evasion numbers for tight ends matter a lot Loveland doesn't have a lot of raw production, and he doesn't have evasion like you would tend to see from the big time guys. Now, I would note that Trey McBride actually didn't either. And also, as you mentioned, playing at a lower level, you watch Trey McBride on an NFL field and you're like, I mean, there rarely is a man among boys element so severe as what you're currently getting with Trey McBride on an NFL field. So, I mean, it's not he's going to definitely bust because he's not Brock Bowers with the ball in his hands. But I guess that part does disconcert me a little bit.
Yeah. So Loveland just really reminds me of a rich man Sam Laporta, where, maybe the counting stats weren't so productive, but you dive deeper into the per route or the yardage market share, and it's really impressive. And so, you can't really contrast the record-breaking counting stats of a Warren or a Fannin to a Loveland, in part just because this Michigan offense was so awful. They were averaging over 200 yards per game the last few years with JJ McCarthy. Last year, if you just take out Colston Loveland, they averaged 84 yards per game. That was over 150 when Loveland was active. Without him, the average is 56.3 yards per game. And so you factor in the games missed, yardage market share would have been the best in at least 50 years, any power conference tight end. You could dig into the yards per route run metrics. I think he ranked second best 2 years ago, behind only Brock Bowers last year, behind only Warren. Targets per route run ranks second best of any power conference player since 2016, behind only Drake London. And so all that stuff matters way more to me than missed tackle production or yards after, which matters like kind of only at the polar extremes where like I'll boost a guy or dock a guy. But to me, just like the key stats that I really favor and look at, I thought this was pretty incredible. So like I kind of get what everyone else is saying as like a round one pick, clear tight end 2. So I like him personally.
We have seen, like, it sounds like between the two of you guys, we're going to have some more, high-end tight end talent coming in this year. We have seen that over the course of the last few years. You referenced there Sam Laporta, then last year with Brock Bowers. It took him a couple of years with Trey McBride is in that category. But there looks to be some good depth to the class in general. Are there any of the players like Terrence Ferguson, Mason Taylor, or Arroyo of excitement to you?
Gunnar Helm didn't really excite me. Mason Taylor didn't really excite me. Ferguson, I mean, he was athletic enough but like all those guys are just kind of in like not going to be a difference.
So are you telling me that, in your FFPC drafts this year, you're going to draft one of those 3 names we talked about a moment ago and leave the rest of them to your league mates to make mistakes?
So we're doing this pre-draft. Like these are not difference maker players in a vacuum pre-hindsight. It's possible they go to a great landing spot. And even then it's kind of more like a year 2 breakout is what I would expect if there's anything. But no, they don't excite me. It was Oronde Gadsden who, just going off of projected draft capital isn't really someone we probably need to talk about, but he was a hyper productive sophomore wide receiver. Or was it? Yeah. Sophomore wide receiver where like he stacked up nicely against some of the best wide receivers in this year's class. And then he transitioned to tight end. And, Chip Kelly's in the NFL. You have Greg Roman in the NFL. Maybe they just make him like a big power slot and we get the tight end designation. That's sort of like a pie in the sky dream, but he's probably the most exciting to me after, the big 3. By the way, with Fannin, I did want to just say, like, I think you can't not still love him. Like, I think worst case scenario is like very rich man's Isaiah Likely. And then hopefully Shawn and I are just right. And it's like the guy just had the most insane tight end season ever. Like he's going to be good.